Last week, I talked about the newly promulgated addendum regarding fixture leases that is addressed in the new contract, paragraph 4B. This video podcast will discuss the terms and provisions of the newly promulgated addendum regarding residential leases that is addressed in the new contract under paragraph 4A. The addendum regarding residential leases will only be used when the property being sold is currently leased to a tenant. If the property is leased, the addendum will be added to the contract and will be used to either negotiate termination of the lease and vacating the tenant prior to possession by buyer, or assumption by and assignment of the lease to the buyer, where the buyer will step into the shoes of the landlord at closing. Paragraph A of the addendum regarding residential lease is the provision that, if checked and agreed to by seller, requires the seller to work with the current tenant to vacate the property. If possession for the buyer under the contract is going to be before the expiration date of the lease, the seller will probably have to compensate the tenant for early termination. This is what we used to call cash for keys. If seller cannot get the tenant out under the existing lease, as required by the buyer under the contract, the buyer will be able to terminate the contract. Paragraph B of the addendum is the provision that says the lease will be assigned to buyer and buyer will assume the position of landlord at closing. If buyer is going to assume the lease, then of course the buyer will need a copy of the landlord-tenant lease. The new addendum provides that either the buyer has already received a copy of the lease, or if not, that the seller has 3 days to deliver a copy of the lease, and then buyer will have a negotiated number of days after receipt to terminate the contract. If the lease is not provided prior to executing the contract, the buyer will have another out under the contract. It would be prudent of the listing agent to obtain a copy of the lease prior to negotiating the contract and providing a copy of the lease, just as you would a seller's disclosure notice prior to execution, so that if the buyer does want to assume the lease, the box that states a copy has already been given can be checked. Another feature of the addendum regarding residential leases that is beneficial to the buyer is where it acts as what I call an estoppel certificate. If buyer is going to assume the lease, then under paragraph B, subparagraph C of the addendum, the seller states to the best of his knowledge that the residential lease is in full force and effect, the tenant is not in default or in violation of any of the lease terms, the tenant has not prepaid rent for which buyers should be credited, the tenant is not entitled to any rent offset, neither tenant nor prior tenant has any claims or disputes with the seller, and there are no undisclosed side agreements between tenant and seller/landlord. Further, the addendum requires seller to disclose any changes in the estoppel statements and cure any defaults of seller/landlord prior to closing. And if seller cannot cure that default, then buyer can terminate the contract. The addendum does provide for security deposit transfer to buyer and buyer's notice to tenant after closing that he or she has stepped into the shoes of the landlord. I hope this video podcast explains the need for and benefit of the addendum regarding residential leases. Again, it will only be necessary when the property being sold is subject to a residential lease at the time of execution of the contract. I am looking forward to seeing you at the closing table soon. Allegiance Title is your trusted resource for results.